Hi everyone, I'm Izzy and I'm the co-founder here at Kind Community, and this is the Kind Community Show. We share stories of founders, activists, and influencers promoting positivity and protection of our planet, discussing how collaboration can help make the sustainable, attainable, and accessible for all. Today's guest really needs no introduction, but if you've been living under a rock, Isaias Hernandez, also known as Queer Brown Vegan on socials, is an environmental educator, writer, and the co-creator of Alluvia Magazine. Today we'll be getting to know Isaias, hearing his story, and exploring the lesser-known parts of climate positivity. Let's discuss. Isaias, it's so nice to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much again for having me.
So I'd like to start from the beginning. I believe you grew up in LA and then you went on to study environmental science at UC Berkeley. Can you paint this journey a little bit more for us? Did you always want to be an environmental educator, and how did your upbringing influence that decision?
Yeah, no, that's such a great question. So a little bit background about me is like I grew up in San Fernando Valley, Los Angeles, so 30 minutes from downtown LA. And I recognized at a young age that I was low income, right? Like we lived in affordable housing, Section 8, and then I lived right next to the public metro and the train station. And so I realized at a very young age, like there was different inequities that were happening in my environment, right? Like when I was going into middle school, which was in a different city and a different zip code that was quote unquote to have more resources than the middle school in my own area, I realized like how much infrastructure change it had and so much more investment it had compared to my community. And so I think like at a very young age, right, I think I recognized ecology and conservation as one of those primary focuses. Or we went to a beach in LA and we had to pick up trash. And then I questioned the teacher and asked, why do we have to pick up trash for them? These are rich communities, like why don't they pick up our trash? And I got silence from that conversation and told I was being disrespectful. So I would say like my curiosity ended up leading me to invest in my environmental journey. And then I think that when I witnessed natural disasters such as wildfires in Southern California, in the early 2000s, there was a fire that actually got almost nearby my home. And I remember they just told us, they had flyers saying like, oh, you can evacuate to this shelter and we can't guarantee if we can protect you or not. So just be ready. And it's like, okay, there was no climate emergency plan. There was no translation plan to that because my parents speak Spanish. And so I was really angry to say that like the systems that were put in place for a lot of people are failing a lot of low-income communities of color. And so when I was in high school, I learned about environmental justice, basically talking about like everyone deserves healthy air, water, and soil, regardless of who you are, your class, your gender, it doesn't matter. And that really made me learn more about the idea of like, it wasn't because my family was poor, it wasn't because they didn't work hard in life that they deserved to live in that environment. I found that it was due to racist policies, systemic racism, and the historical redlining that allowed these communities to live there nearby toxic facilities and deal with several environmental pollutants. And so that really made me validated to be like, okay, I'm going to study the environment. And so in college, when I did environmental science, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. And so I chose this holistic major because it had both the physical, biological, and social sides to it. And so I got different experiences from research, heavy sciences like physics, like chemistry, and then like, social studies like policy and research. Like these were all really important to me. And so I did that because I was like, didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. And I also was met with a lot of classism, racism, and the lack of diversity in these institutions that don't really care about people of color. Like they say they do, but in reality, these majors were not very supportive of our growth. And when it comes to self-critical thoughts or challenging professors or individuals, it was usually shut down. And so I really felt like my experiences in academia helped me become more of a better educator to reckon with these perspectives.
That's so interesting. I think just taking from the story you shared around when you were younger and picking up plastics in higher income communities, but you're still curious. I think it's a huge lesson for us all to realize that children are so curious and want these answers. And it actually should probably teach us to unlearn what we think we know. And it may have been the case where they just actually didn't have the answer, but to be shut down, I think it's like really empowering to know that that kind of led you to what you're doing today. But that's really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. You've accomplished so much already in your life, but could you describe, maybe, was there a particular year or experience, maybe it was the one that you already shared, that was your most formative or your most directional in becoming who you are today?
Yeah, I think that my senior year, so I believe when you're turning 20 to 21, there's this like mindset that you're going to be an adult at 21. In reality, I'm 25 now, and I feel like, oh my God, like at 21, I was trying to act like an adult when I was literally a child still. And so I think that like that was a very transformative year for me, because I realized that there was obviously these injustices, there was issues in academic institutions, but then I told myself, okay, you know what, like whatever you want to do beyond graduation, like is up to you, and you're going to manifest that career, whatever you want. And so I felt like at that time I understood that academia wasn't going to be the place where I can grow fully. It was a part of my growth, which I really thanked for, but I realized like that wasn't for me. And so when I graduated, a lot of people shifted the conversation from what are you doing to the weekend, or to do you have a full-time job yet? What are you doing post-grad? And I was like so overwhelmed. And for me, I realized getting rejected from all the environmental NGOs and environmental focused jobs was a sign for me to take a step back and to realize what actually are my true talents. And so I ended up getting a job at a creative agency in New York City, which a lot of people were surprised in my work, like why I was doing that, because that's not who I was. I did have a passion for creativity, but I didn't know how to intersect both environmentalism and creativity together. And so that really helped me, because that year I felt like I didn't know what exactly I wanted to do, but behind my head, I said, the only thing that you can do right now is the moment and the act of participating and taking risk. And so I think those were really supplementary for me as an adult now, that I'm more solidified and more assured of like what I'm doing. And I'm thankful that when I was younger, I didn't listen to too many other people's opinions and listen to myself.
Yeah, it is so interesting. I find now, like if you go to any events or you're meeting people for the first time, one of the first questions that they ask you is, what do you do? And I think it's so important that maybe we reframe that question to like, who are you, or what do you stand for, or what's your purpose? Because there are situations where you can't necessarily be in a position to work and put what, like, you know, your passions or what you really want to stand for, and merge those two. And if you can, that's amazing. But there's just some people who just can't in where they are in life.
Yeah, exactly. And I think these are kind of more the humanization questions about being a human being, right? It's like, I think this is the realities of post-grad, that people have this community and then they're kind of uprooted, and then they're just into this corporate system where it's like, I'm only here to work and get my paycheck, not really here to be friends with you.
Yeah, exactly. I want to touch on your 3 key pillars of content. I believe they're environmental justice, veganism, and zero waste. Can you talk us through the importance of these 3 pillars and what they mean to you, specifically around veganism? Because I think veganism can mean different things for different people. So I would love to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, definitely. So I would say that I use environmental justice as a global lens to both validate the work in veganism and zero waste. So my veganism is very centralized in both advocating for animal and human liberation intertwined. And I really believe that using an environmental justice lens allows us to extend ourselves to that local and system change, because we know that factory farms are located generally in low-income communities of color. The waterways are polluted due to animal waste. The methane that is released to the air. And so what ends up happening is that these people that are typically migrant farm workers that have to live in those areas are the ones that have the highest rates of health risk. Not only that from a factory farm setting, but if you look into the people who pick our food, I think I recognize as a vegan myself, like I do partake in a globalized food system that upholds unsustainable futures. The people who are picking my food are exposed to toxic chemicals. And so my diet, my lifestyle, I would say, is not cruelty free, but it's centered on a justice lens where I'm advocating for both animal rights justice, human rights justice, and migrant justice, because many of these people are people like me. My own grandpa actually was part of the Bracero program here in the United States. And so he actually partook in this globalized food market, having to come from Mexico to the United States and back seasonally to grow food. And so I think myself, like, I really focus on decentralizing global food markets while localizing food systems, one that is animal cruelty free. And so that is something that I've been advocating for since being vegan for almost 3 years now.
Wow. And then in terms of your content, so for people who are on social and are trying to grow kind of or put out their message, can you give us a bit of insight on how you go from idea, design to then post? What does that work look like? I assume there's a lot that goes into it.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that with any idea, right, you should put it out there in different media forms, right? I think a lot of the times people get stuck on comparing themselves and then wanting it to be perfect, and then end up destroying their mindset of that project. So I would say try different experiments, right? So I did magazines before. You can do a zine, you can do a podcast. Like, there's these ideas that can be constructed from these issues. And I would say, like, the best way that you want to engage with your audience or creating something that's built off your values is asking yourself, like, what are your personal thoughts about these issues? What are your personal outtakes on this? Because more often than not, a lot of people on social media are often scared to write what they're really feeling. And having that one person that we followed before, like in different categories, that you can relate to both emotionally and spiritually and mentally, like it helps you so much to know that you're not the only one thinking about this. So I would say trying different media forms and also different opportunities to present that, right? It's like when it comes to designing it, do you want to take the infographic approach? Do you want to take the reel approach? Do you want to take the video approach? Do you want to take an imagery post? Like, there's different ways that we can optimize over time, but I think that it's all about experimentation rather than perfection, because perfection is at a toll unsustainable, and it ends up killing creativity. And so I would say, like, you want to create content that is not designed to consume easily, but to be consumed and talked about in an accessible way.
Sorry, can you just say that one more time?
Yeah, you want to make sure that the content you create is not designed to consume easily, but to be consumed and talked about easily. Because what happens is many people believe that when you consume content, that it's actually helping these people, but in reality, you're just eating it, right? And you're not saying it.
I see what you mean. Just like feeding the beast that is social media rather than actually putting out content that's valuable to people. And it's so true about stunting creativity. Sometimes I think for us, sometimes we'll get so caught up in an idea and we want it to be perfect. And then it's kind of like the moment's now passed, or now we kind of just lost it because we just focused too much. And then also being okay with not knowing or not having an answer. And it is tough to be quite vulnerable, I think, on social, but I think it is received quite well of just not saying, like, I always know the answer to everything, especially around these types of topics. There's so much to learn. So another thing is, like, well, you're obviously very big on creative environmental work, and it's perhaps a side of the arts that some might still associate with, like, taping egg boxes together or making rockets out of recycled plastic bottles at school. But can you tell us a bit more about Alluvia Magazine and how that came about and how it's been received?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say Alluvia Magazine was actually during when I was 20 and 21. So what ended up happening is that I had this idea of, like, I was so tired of looking at environmental magazines, like, from different publications that often really did not center that many diverse voices. And if they did, they were usually climbers, like people who bike, people who do swimming, which is really great. But I would say that there was a lack of representation when it comes to the environmental arts, right? Like, and you kind of touched upon this, right? I wanted to get people who were studying the environment or who typically do not look like quote unquote environmentalists, because the imagery that is usually put out there is just generally someone who is a white male or someone with a lab coat. And so I wanted to disrupt that image with my best friend. And so we created Alluvia Magazine that focuses on just highlighting Black, Indigenous, people of color environmentalists that are doing different sectors, right? We had different artists that were doing food and regenerative agriculture in the Bay Area. We had other people who were doing writing and poetry through the Asian American experience. And so I wanted to kind of highlight this to let other younger people know that there are people in this movement that do look like you. Because when I entered the environmental field in Berkeley, I was like, oh my God, like, am I really in the right place? Like, I don't relate to any of my students, my friends, like, I don't have the same lived experiences of going camping and like going to go backpacking across the world. Like, I don't have that experience. I feel like there's maybe something wrong with me. And so I think like that was a really beautiful project because it taught me how to design, taught me how to talk with others, it taught me how to like, like to interview people and like how to really transpire their narrative into imagery, into words. And so that was really empowering for that. And we had a launch party for it, which was really fun before I left to New York. And so that was really great because we really harnessed a community and like grew a community of environmentalists that are passionate about it. And this kind of led people to learn more about, food justice or like policy or like poetry. And that's really what matters, is creating a community. And I will say the hardest thing was that the funding issue, right? Like it's hard to create a publication that is independent, right? And knowing that we created one publication that's on my website now, I decided to step away from the project just because I realized it's a lot of work and I wanted to do new things. But I think Alluvia Magazine will always be there. But also I wish other people create collective magazines out of it.
And how do people get involved if they want to collaborate with you?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say like people, if they ever want to collaborate, feel free to email me at queerboundvegan@gmail.com. But you can definitely message me on Instagram. I'm currently working on a new project that it's called Influencers for Redistribution. So getting influencers, PR packages of products to a centralized collective meetup and where we can donate it to people or people can pick it up.
Oh, that's fantastic. I think it's so true what you said around like the power of communities and a collective and just getting those intersectional conversations going, because we're not going to find solutions or any creative ideas if it's just the same people with the same lived experiences coming together to talk about things that impact a community. And it definitely you need to see that reflected in the people making those decisions and putting out that content. So kudos to you. It's amazing work. And I think what really inspires me about your journey is the fact that you've decided to become the very person you felt was missing in your life. But also your realization that there was a need for simplified, I think, educational content that brought tough environmental concepts within reach for people. But since you've started this journey, do you think that the conversation has changed at all? And have you noticed conversations evolved, and what are we still not talking about that you think that we should be focusing a bit more on?
Yeah, definitely. I would say like the culture, the shift has definitely changed a lot in the last 2 years, especially during 2020 in the pandemic, the rise of social, racial, environmental injustices, especially with BLM. I saw a huge influx of especially white folks wanting to be invested in talking about environmental justice. And that really makes me happy because I feel that to build a stronger movement, we need different people from different perspectives. And the fact that they felt comfortable to talk to me about these things. And, I'm not going to shun them away. I'm going to be like, I'm going to hold space for you. But I also expect you to take this information and hold space to others who may not understand, because I remember being in rooms around with my white classmates having to talk about environmental justice, and it became an uncomfortable topic for them. And I was like, this should not be an uncomfortable topic. This is literally people's lives are dying because of pollution. So I would say that has definitely changed. I would say like the larger scale, what I want people to kind of understand is that these injustices are itself not linked to the extractivism and people being hoarding wealth, right? That's one of those things. But the idea of how white supremacy itself has manifested in these different environments and these different movements, and how it's tried to really destroy and kill these people. And not to forget that land defenders that are composed of like Black and Indigenous voices and people are the ones who have the highest rates of violence. They are typically women, non-binary, trans women. This is a women's rights issue too. This is a queer issue. And so we cannot really tell ourselves like the idea of like, yay, like I know about environmental justice without acting upon it. And so I always say, like, I read this book called The Red Deal that says, why would you want to die having the quote unquote right political views, but never extending that allyship or never extending that to your own neighborhood, than having someone saying, I don't know everything, but I'm going to fight and learn and be in the front lines or different things and continuously learn. So I always tell people never to make themselves feel so comfortable, but to be ready to be wrong than to be right.
Yeah. It leads well into my next question. Wanting to talk around climate doomism, and one thing that I find that you champion is a sense of kind of like careful, maybe positivity, if that's the right term, I'm not sure. But obviously there are communities that are, of course, disenfranchised and often left behind in the climate fight, like we're discussing now. But you rightfully highlight the difference certain movements are making, and specifically outside the scope of Westernization. But can you share with us any success stories that you return to when, I don't know, perhaps in need of motivation?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like, it really depends on locally in your community, because I think that with climate doomism, right, people are being exposed to global news. Local journalism has rapidly declined, meaning that a lot of people don't even know what's happening in their area. Maybe they get alerted about like someone being stabbed or someone being robbed. Like, this is unfortunate news. But I think that with climate doomism, like, people are now kind of realizing that their own quote unquote protection was never actually real. It was only protected for those who in the elite, those who have massive amounts of wealth, right, are able to protect themselves through this. But I would say that one of the success stories I always look back actually is in my own community when they've sued the city for their negligence. I think about the frontline activists that helped stop different pipelines, especially with Keystone XL, right? That wasn't me. Those are water protectors that were doing that. And so I use these different movements to understand that the people are the ones who are in the resistance of this movement that have been creating a just future for us. And never to forget that we have different and unique roles in this movement. I'm not asking people ever to be frontline activists, right? If that's not your thing, that's not your thing. But be in different roles, be a supporter, be an artist, be a podcaster, be these change makers, because this is what's going to have more globalized and collectivized vulnerability to create this change. And so I would say also, I look back at my own successes, right? At the end of the day, I don't measure my success by the follower count, but I measure my success or my happiness based off the conversation I'm able to have with someone that they're very concerned, and they felt so confident and so safe to share that information with me via private message. And having those one-on-one conversations with college students and stuff keeps me inspired to know that, like, we are fighting for our future, and we're going to do it differently. That's what really makes me hopeful.
So true. I think I really like how you say we could all have a different role to play. In a previous podcast I recorded with Alita Fabiano, she's a person with a disability, and we were talking about activism and how there's such a cookie cutter view of like what an activist should look like in this space. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be on the front lines if it's not accessible to you. You know, there's so many different roles that people can play in these conversations. So yeah, thank you for mentioning that. And what institutional changes would you like to see that steer the climate action spotlight away from its current whitewash landscape?
I would say that, one of the institutional changes I'd love to see is to the governments declare a climate emergency, because we're no longer in this phase of global warming. We're no longer in climate change. We're no longer in a climate crisis. We're literally in a climate emergency. Some people call it climate chaos, right? Like right now, we don't. Honestly, the series of events that we keep seeing, no one really knows what's going to happen next, and it keeps getting worse. And so I think that by adding this illustrative name to it, it kind of gives this more, yes, doom, right? But also gives this part of hope of like, now that we've recognized that this is a very dire issue, governments must work together. And so I think that's one of the ways that it would help people and to really challenge those that are anti-environmentalists and climate realists, because there's a lot of people who don't believe in climate change still. And I think a lot of the times those that do affect the climate, that get affected by natural disasters, that are low-income communities that don't believe in it, end up blaming the system rather than the ecological crisis. And so there's a lot to unpack there for sure.
Definitely. And now, on the flip side, what role does self-love, assurance, and of course queerness play in your daily climate activism? So you've mentioned before about adopting an attitude of acceptance and leaving room for mistakes. So what helps you do this in your day-to-day?
Yeah, I would say that, one of the biggest things about queerness for me and why I use queerness is that I believe in existing in multidimensional spaces, one being the heteronormative world that we live in, another in the queer world, but in the different worlds of like animalia and plants, like there's just so much that we often do not really understand, and that's how complex and unique our systems are in nature. But I would say like the one way I kind of kept myself accountable is meeting people who are willing to have those conversations with me and sit me down and educate me and expect me to do better. Because I think that there's a difference between people who will criticize you and then tell you you're not doing enough, but will not give you feedback because they're too tired to tell you, but yet they constantly criticize you. But then there's people who will criticize you, which are your friends, and hold you accountable and bring you in and say like, look, what you said was kind of problematic. Like you should really rethink the way that you're trying to talk about these things. And so I would say that it's a learning process and it's cyclical, right? Like I think like a lot of times people are so scared saying like, I want to get it right. I want to say the right questions right. I want to make sure I don't say something offensive to them. And it's going to happen. And even if you didn't think about it consciously and you had the intent of this is not problematic, this isn't going to be viewed this way, it does affect others. And I think taking accountability of like, I didn't recognize this perspective, I have a lot to do, that kind of shows that allyship and sustainable activism for me.
I love that. It's like getting comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Preservation of our world is one thing, but protection of our communities suffering from capitalistic environmental neglect is another. And this is going to be a bit of a loaded question. But how do you think we can individually contribute in making the sustainable attainable and accessible for all?
Yes, I would say that there needs to be a constant collaboration, right? If we want to be a sustainable society, we need to get to know our neighbors, because at the end of the day, I think a lot of people are recognizing how mutual aid is very resilient and very sustainable in protecting its citizens when the government does not. So I would say like building these coalitions of different groups, from youth to millennials to older generations, this gives us a more intergenerational view of how you want to build that sustainable future, right? And when it comes to accessibility, we're talking about sustainable products, like asking ourselves, like, what are ways that we can do to help decentralize the system and make it a more accessible system, whether it be a pay it forward system, whether it be a sliding scale system. There's these different economic models that have always existed in many low-income communities, and that's how really economic wealth has been generated through there, is that we give back to our community and they give back to us. And so I think this is what more people need, rather than asking themselves like, where do I go? I need to go to the policy makers. I need to go to this. I need to study this, and end up leaving their communities and then feeling even more lost and stressed out, like what they're really doing.
It's so true. I think that's kind of one of the questions that we're trying to really tackle with Kind Community is actually, how do we make it sustainability accessible to everyone? And it seems like there's so many different facets to that, but it really just does come down to collaborating and getting to your neighbors and really acting as a community, the true definition of what that is.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like too, when we're shaping a sustainable society, that it's defined, especially for Black and Indigenous peoples, and with the obviously emphasis with people with disabilities, people who are queer and trans, because most of the times these people are left out of these conversations. And so when we think about safety and resiliency, it needs to embody a holistic lens, not just a lens for cis heteronormative people or cis queer male people. Like we need to ensure that it's defined by the people who are the most affected, and this actually creates a regenerative world.
Definitely. Before our quick fire round, can you give us a bit of insight into what's next for you?
Yeah, definitely. I would say like the next things that are up for Queer Brown Vegan is I'm finishing up a book proposal. I'm in the process of trying to get a book deal with my literary agent. Really excited for that. Hopefully I get to announce that once I get approved. That is one thing I'm doing. Another thing is I'm working on YouTube finally, just recording my first video with equipment and everything. And so I'm super excited to finally try that out and enter the digital YouTube world.
Oh, that's fantastic. When do you sleep? This is insane. You're just doing so much.
Yeah, I would say I sleep at typically midnight. I make sure if it's midnight, turn off everything. I'm like, go to sleep now, and I wake up at 8 or 8:20. So 8 hours of sleep is
all
okay.
Right.
It's okay. Yeah. It could be more, but I would say having that, and also a balanced schedule, meaning that on weekends I don't work, and I make sure not to work because those are my days off.
Yeah, no, it's important to give that space, but that's absolutely fantastic. I can't wait for your YouTube channel and looking forward to hearing more about your book. But for the quick fire round, how do you define sustainability?
Yes, I would define sustainability as a Black, Indigenous, people of color traditional way of viewing, meaning that creating a circular relationship with the land, communities, and self that does not degrade the environment. And so it fosters for biodiversity and cultural diversity.
What are you most hopeful for?
I'm hopeful for the resistance because I believe that so many people now are continuously resisting their own systems that have continuously oppressed them. And so my role as a supporter in this movement is to recognize how do I want to communicate this language so people are not afraid and reckon with themselves of how do we create a just future and how does that look like? Because I think a lot of times we cannot continue romanticizing about the future. We have to act upon, and that's not always going to look pretty.
Absolutely. And who inspires you?
I think what inspires me the most would be, this is such a good question. I would say my community, right? Because I think that so many people have so much more talent than I do. Like the amount of people I've met via online or Zoom or Google Meets, they have been doing amazing work and they don't post it online because they don't want to or they don't feel safe to. But I think that really humanizing people's experiences and getting to meet them is one of the best things I ever wanted in life because I used to be more social in college. And so I would say that meeting people now is like really fun, especially via Zoom because it's more interactive in some ways. But of course, I love the human interaction part.
Definitely. Well, I'll hit you up next time I'm in New York.
Yes, please.
And where do you hope to be in 10 years' time?
That's a good question. I just want to be alive and healthy with my loved ones. I think that's the greatest gift I can have and receive. And my community being fine and my best friends and loved ones being okay.
It's amazing. You're so grounded, Isaias, and thank you so much for speaking with me today. I feel like I've learned so much, and I'm going to have to probably listen to this over a couple of times
to
really grasp it all. But it was just so great learning more about you and your educational stance that you're taking towards climate action. Can you let our audience know once more, again, where to find you and if they can join and collaborate with you?
Yeah, you can definitely find me at Queer Brown Vegan on any types of socials, even on LinkedIn. And you can head over to queerbrownvegan.com to find free resources on projects I've done to check me out my work or collaborate with me.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And to everybody listening, if you enjoyed my conversation today with Isaias, please do share, like, and subscribe for more conversations. We go live every Friday and very much look forward to having you join us next week. Have a wonderful weekend.